let's talk a little bit about cancel culture and censorship and the difference between private moderation and public control. Because I'm at the point now where I think that, I mean, this is very maybe libertarian or bourgeois, but I think that if we were living under conditions where a few big tech companies could decide who could talk and who couldn't based on their individual whims, that we would be better off than we actually are right now. What's happening now is that because of a multitude of organizations' interference, but primarily I point to the Department of Homeland Security, we have moderation. We have policies that are being put in place by some sort of basically the NATO line is being implemented as far across the board as is possible. So like the fact that there are still a few private capitalists out there bucking the trend, like Rumble or X, or at one point Parler even, is a good thing. Even if it is all for private profit and even if it isn't the communist utopia that you might want to produce, so you could have true and full free speech rights. It's better. We're better off when there's a diversity, the kind of diversity that emerges from competition between capitalists, rather than where the tech companies have to bow down to the state in order to maintain their business license or have the executive take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're going to have, it's like if we lived in a libertarian dystopia where all of the streets were owned by individual rich people, then I would much rather have the main street in town be owned by like a free speech billionaire who would let people have protest marches down the street than have it be owned by a non-free speech billionaire, who wasn't willing to allow that. And certainly if you had the DHS in here applying any sort of pressure that would, on people to be more like the second kind, that would be bad. Right. But I also don't think you should have to just sort of hope that that you have sort of that you have like relatively benevolent capitalists, not relatively less benevolent capitalists, making these decisions about what we can say and what we can't say, and all of that, right? I think that it's I think that is a problem, right? And by very rough analogy, right? You think about like the McCarthyism in the 1950s, that this is there's certainly actually in a much clearer way there, right? Than there is right now. Because a lot of what we're talking about, I think with the DHS stuff is sort of behind the scenes, and it's maybe a little unclear how much it's just sort of like what exactly the levers of pressure are, and it's not good, regardless, but I think that, like in the 1950s case, it's much clearer, you have, that you have like very loudly, right. You have people in government, demanding that, companies, Hollywood studios, for example, purge commies, and them actually doing it. Right. And
well, I'm going to push back on this.
But like, just to finish the thought, right? Mm-hmm. It's not if we sort of had if we sort of had an immaculate Red Scare, right? That the sort of Red Scare that Robert Nozick couldn't have an objection to, where you had it was it was purely the patriotic zeal of studio bosses that that led them to institute a blacklist, and it had absolutely nothing to do with government pressure. I mean, I guess that'd be slightly better, but like, I actually don't think it would be much better.
It would be way better. And two things. One, now the state didn't hide that they were directly calling upon the tech companies to censor speech. That was said over and over again by people like Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, and others. It's been and the threats came directly as well. The threat was to basically take away their business license by making them no longer protected from lawsuits. I think it's
that's an odd basically sentence, right? Those are two very different things.
No, they would tie the two things together. Either you do something about disinformation, or we will take away your protection from litigation.
No. I get that, right? Like, I have but that's still, it's still a very different thing from taking away a business license. Is saying that that you don't have this special protection that isn't given to other kinds of businesses, etc. Right? That, like, because it's very, and don't get me wrong, I think it would be bad to
it'd be like saying you don't have we're no longer going to rent the telephone poles to you if you're the telephone company.
I think it would be like saying that. I think that they have I think it would maybe be like saying that God, I don't know what the analogy would be in this case, but I mean, like, but you're talking about immunity from people suing you, right? Like not giving it immunity from private citizens suing you does seem to be very unlike saying you can't have a business license or you can't use the telephone poles, right? Like I think pragmatically it would be bad to take it away, because
it's the same in so much as the companies couldn't function without that legal protection.
I don't know
just like the telecommunication companies couldn't function without being able to rent the telephone poles, in my example. The threat would have been cataclysmic if acted upon. It would have at the very least broken them up, but probably meant the end of social media as we understand it, because you would have to have editors in between the users on social media and
I think they would get much more censorious if that happened, which would be very bad. I don't know that it would mean, like, it would probably just be that, there'd be like a much lower threshold for being censored, because people, because they'd be worried about being sued, which again would be bad. But I think it would be bad because it'd be bad for,
the second point. So if you don't think that it would have been, that's a threat to put them out of business. Okay, I disagree. But then the second point is, in the case of today's censorship, as opposed to during the McCarthy era, we actually have, and maybe this exists in the McCarthy era, and I don't know about it, but we actually have the paper trail, and we know of the institutions that were created in order to direct the censorship.
Well, this is what I'm saying. In the McCarthy era, it wouldn't be like, oh my God, we discovered a paper trail. You just open the newspaper, right? Like, this is not, this isn't.
No, you could open the newspapers now as well. Many newspapers were calling for the censorship of tech. Many newspapers were calling for censorship. Not saying you open. Hold on, wait, no. No. I'm saying that unlike during the McCarthy era, the direct pressure put from the state onto the tech companies is documented. It's not just a matter of some public statements. It's also the systematic and institutionalized, technologically implemented system of monitoring and controlling what was said.
So what were the like? I mean, this is something much more about than I do. Partially because I for reasons I've been sort of going through, I find it largely irrelevant. I don't think it like quite I think that whatever's true about this, I think it's a bit of a sideshow, right? It's not the main problem, but since you do know much more about this, I mean, what was the, like in this paper trail, what was the sort of, what were the pressure points? I mean, what was the, they like they would say like here's here's the stuff that we want you to censor, and if you don't do it,
well, the first of all, they created a hub for state officials and for NGOs and for the intelligence community to communicate with the tech companies. So I'm not talking about the pressure point anymore. I'm talking about level of control.
But I think, sure, but I think that this is it's only the level of control.
If you had letters and phone calls documented and recorded where J. Edgar Hoover called up the editor of the New York Times and said, do not publish that guy, never hire him, and that was recorded. That's the level that we've got when it comes to censorship online. Only it's not one guy, it's tens of thousands and beyond that, millions.
New York Times has, of course, gotten many documented requests to not publish things from the national security state over the decades. They've usually ceded to them, but yeah, I think that what I'm saying is in terms of like the distinction, because I think the difference between us here is not that like, look, if the state is encouraging corporate censorship, that's bad. We agree on that. But then like, how bad is corporate censorship if it's, like.
I'll put it to you this way. Manufacturing consent was written to demonstrate that corporate censorship could, in some ways, nearly but not quite reach the level of state censorship. If you read manufacturing consent, people thought it was a little hyperbolic, but it was saying, look, sure, we're not the Soviet Union, but we have our own form of censorship.
I guess it's been a long time, but my memory of manufacturing consent was that it wasn't really about censorship per se, right? Like it was.
It was, but it was about a more covert. It was not direct.
Because it was about propaganda, right? I mean, This is that in other words, it's less about censorship than it is about like how narratives are shaped, right? And there's also a really important distinction here because I think that a lot of in fact, look, something that a lot of conservatives will point out that I actually agree with them about is that there's a fundamental distinction, right? Even without any sort of element of government encouragement or coercion, or again, I think what pressure points there are, I think, is a really important question for filling out that story. But that even something a lot of conservatives will point out is it's like, look, there's a fundamental difference between a organization like the New York Times and an organization like Twitter or YouTube, right? That a media, like a publisher, is like it's completely fine for a publisher to have an editorial line to sort of determine like what's worth publishing and what isn't, right? That's all legitimate, right? That there are sort of free speech adjacent questions we could ask about that, right? That I wouldn't want to dismiss, but I mean, there is a sort of core legitimacy to all of that. Whereas if you're talking about Twitter or YouTube, then you're not talking about a publisher, right? You're talking about things that are supposed to be a neutral platform, they're supposed to fill this role as a neutral platform, and that makes corporate censorship, even if it's initiated at the corporate level with zero government encouragement, much more disturbing. It would be like if we privatized the post office, and one of the companies that ended up like sort of taking up a big share of what had been the business of USPS, decided that we're not going to carry certain magazines through the mail because we disapprove of their political content because like they're against the war in Ukraine or something, right? That would be more the equivalent than like the New York Times making an editorial decision.
Okay, well, I want to think about this for a second because I'm tempted to agree with you, but I want to clarify something here. But
Sure.
the First Amendment, the people whose rights were trod upon weren't fundamentally the tech companies, right? Every user of social media has First Amendment rights. They can be intruded upon by private companies. Okay, so like if I don't have the responsibility to publish any book.
Yeah.
Okay. Even and Twitter or Facebook, they don't actually have to post anyone's posts. They can decide arbitrarily who they allow to publish and who to post or not. They're not the same thing as they're not treated the same way as the post office or the telephone companies. They are somewhere in between, but they have the right to create their own moderation policies. The trouble here, the reason this is so extreme,
legally they have the right. That's the problem.
Right. Well, but listen, that's an earlier argument. Okay, that's before what we know now. What the reason this is so extreme is the state constitutionally is not allowed to intervene to censor anyone's speech. That's all. So not only did the state intervene and censor the speech of tech companies, but they're also intervening to censor the speech of, the first one that comes to mind is RFK Jr. And he was a prominent example of someone who was censored on Twitter. But it was really millions of people whose speech was suppressed systematically. Both, on the one hand, you had threats of deregulation that would put these companies out of business. On the other side, you had FBI agents and others communicating daily with the companies. And further, you had hubs of communication. It's like well beyond just opening up a Slack chat, but it's like a Slack chat between the Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, 3 or 4 nonprofit organizations funded by the federal government, founded by the Department of Homeland Security, all communicating with the tech and media, not just social media, but also them. And their long fuse report, they say our goal should be to continue to help set the moderation policies for these companies, and basically they say infiltrate and to influence reporting on every level within mainstream media, and by embedding into these organizations, and pre-bunking stories before they arose would be part of it. I mean, what was being exerted here was an attempt to exert basically of control over all of the communications infrastructure in the country.
Yeah. So if you're talking about a legal constitutional question, right, then they're certainly not allowed to legally force companies to print something or not to print something. But maybe more about the First Amendment jurisprudence here that's relevant, that's already happened than I do. But my understanding would be that it's at least much less clear that it's illegal, right? It's unconstitutional, to make requests, right? So like when the New York Times, for example, infamously delayed its reporting about like the CIA black sites in Europe for like a year until after the 2004 election at the at the request of whoever in the Bush administration, CIA, whatever, who muttered some half-baked nonsense about national security in their ear, say that they shouldn't report it. They said, okay. I don't know that there's any court ruling that would say that was illegal, right?
There are court rulings on this. Yes.
Because I know, because if they'd tried to do what they did, like with the Pentagon Papers, and say like, oh, we're going to like actually try to legally stop you from printing this, right? That's definitely illegal. But just to make the request, it's unclear to me that it is. And
there was a case with a bookstore where the bookstore received several requests to no longer carry, like I think a sex manual or some sort of sexual education material. And it was at a state level. Okay. And the court found that amounted to basically a violation of the First Amendment due to the amount of pressure.
Supreme Court case, or is this like?
Yeah, I think it was a Supreme Court case.
Okay, because say like that sort of thing happens quite frequently. And if they were able to, if it went through court and they were able to win the case, presumably a big part of how the government would be able to win the case there would be to say, look, there's no legal force here. There's just a request that a private company voluntarily complied with. Whereas, notice, well, hold on just a second. Like, notice here,
we can't reduce that angle. But in fact, there is a legal case.
That would surely be their argument, and what that argument would rely on is precisely the petty despotism of the private company that could do whatever they want because it's their property, right? That you couldn't like. So like, you could have,
however,
a government that was constrained by a First Amendment requesting that a street owner not allow unfortunately to go down the street, and they would have at least a much better case that they weren't violating the First Amendment, and they would have at least a much better case to make that they weren't violating the First Amendment, that if it were a public street, they just hadn't allowed it.
Okay. That has been adjudicated on. There has been a case, there's precedent for simply requesting that something be censored amounting to a First Amendment violation. Okay. However, that's not what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about creating institutions whose purpose is to censor.
Yeah, but that's
within the government. Within the government.
But that's fundamentally, look, if you're just talking about an institution to streamline requests that the private owner can then still make the call about whether to honor the requests or not, then you are still very much in the territory of, is the request itself unconstitutional? Now, maybe you're right, and there's like there's some body of clear enough Supreme Court precedents that this is settled law. Like I said, I wouldn't claim to know as much about this as you do, right? But I would imagine that, that to the extent that there's any kind of legal ambiguity about that, then it would be precisely because that it's still ultimately the call of the media oligarchs whether to honor the request or not, which does sort of get back to my sort of core argument that it's like, look, I don't think we should have this sort of impoverished libertarian conception of free speech. I think that.
Yeah, but I think you're being completely disingenuous here, Ben. I mean, I'm a little appalled because you're using an apparently stronger argument for free speech to justify.
No, I'm not. I'm going to stop you right there, Doug. That's not true.
Violation. Hold on.
You know I'm not justifying it.
Oh, hold on.
No, Doug. Sorry,
to argue for the Democratic Party's case that's coming up to the Supreme Court and push and push and push as if it's reasonable. It is not reasonable. Okay, there has been precedents before. Just showing that if you just chat them up.
Doug, I'm not saying it's reasonable. I've said the opposite.
If you just chat them up, you are violating the First Amendment. That's been shown in the past. You also the government can pass no law to infringe upon.
Doug,
they certainly can't build an institution.
If you're going to rant and mute me, I'm going to have to say goodbye.
Okay.
But they have a Like,
I mean, you were talking. I was trying to intervene before, and I'd like to be able to finish my thought as well. And I don't want to be interrupted. I want to get to the end of the point. Okay, and I'm not ranting. I'm telling you the facts as I understand them.
yeah, but you were lying about my position. You said I was justifying it. I was absolutely not.
You know whatever your self-conception is.
No,
fact
I'm
is,
just not. That's a lie. That's not true.
how is that a lie? Tell me
I'm
how.
not justifying it. I'm against it. I've told you over and over again that I'm against it. I'm in print talking about how I'm
Why do you
against
think I think you're against it? I mean, why do I think you're justifying it? Why do you think I'm saying you're justifying it?
Because I think that on this particular subject, you tend to get worked up and you tend to assume that anything that's not sufficiently enthusiastic agreement on every single aspect of what you're saying must be people secretly taking the position that you see yourself as being against.
Okay, but I don't think you're saying it's not a secret. You're what you've been saying is there is that one, it's not a very important story. Two, that it's actually what's more important is the corporate censorship rather than the state intervention. And three, of course, the state, and this is Biden's argument, can politely request these corporations to suppress Seymour Hersh's reporting. And, you know, of course, they have the legal right to do so. And it's not just Seymour Hersh, but I picked that example. But whereas what I see is when you combine not only the obvious First Amendment violations that started with just the development of the Department of Homeland Security organization to direct what's online, that is in itself was a violation of the First Amendment. When you justify that by saying, oh, they're simply streamlining the legally protected requests of these tech companies, that's, to me, that is taking up the Democratic Party line, which, by the way, tomorrow will be the Republican Party line. It's not like it's, but the third thing I want to say, though, about this is that, it's not just in the United States. And the fact that there's cooperation between nations and in Europe, they can outright pass laws to censor because they don't have the First Amendment, means that the U.S. government, Department of Homeland Security, can pressure these international organizations to suppress the kind of information we get within our own country by asking the UK to do it or Australia to do it.
So I'd said over and over and over and over again that obviously I'm against it. I've talked about being against it in articles that I've sent you in the past. I think you have to have a really Manichaean view of this to somehow interpret me as justifying something I've not only said in print and that I've said like over and over in this conversation that I'm against. That's fucking appalling, frankly. Second, in your reconstruction of my argument, you said, oh, I'm saying, of course this is legal. No, I didn't. That's very different from what I said, Doug. Jesus Christ. I said, I think that there is probably some legal ambiguity here. And obviously that doesn't mean, in fact, I think very deferential. I said, I think you know more about this than I do. I'm open to being corrected on this, but I do think that there's.
Well, I corrected you about whether or not there was legal precedent for simply chatting up, just making the requests themselves amounting to a free speech violation. It does. Okay. And when you add in the fact that you're talking about the other doc would be to say, well, no, the majority of these requests weren't coming from CISA themselves, but from these NGOs. When you add in the fact that
said, because I know what you'd say about that. Like, I'm very aware of your position on this. It's from earlier in the conversation.
Right.
Again, my point here is not right that I think this is fine. And you didn't listen to me the first 20 times I said it. So maybe the 21st time you'll believe me, because I know you really want me for some reason to be your enemy on this. I don't want that at all. I just hear you when you make these arguments that the First Amendment isn't being overturned or moved around. I don't hear it as different than people who said, listen, if you don't have it, I hear it as a different argument, but to me, this is not different from the Snowden revelations of mass surveillance of the population. And the only difference is, from my point of view, is that
in this case, we have it mostly coming out of the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party when the Snowden revelations came forward. But the violation of the people's rights are the same in both cases. And in fact, when comes down to controlling what people say rather than spying on them, the political ramifications are much more severe. If you can't speak and be heard, and how can you organize an independent left? How can you organize an independent socialist movement if there's a true clampdown on public speech? And the aim here is to create that condition. That's okay now.
Yeah, I think that limitations on what people can say on social media are really bad. I have been banging this drum for longer than you have. I have this is something that I've been talking about very consistently for a very long time. I think that that's really bad. I agree with you that government promoting that is also bad, right? We agree on that. I would obviously hope that if this is adjudicated in court, that the Supreme Court rules the way that, they interpret the relevant precedents the way that you do, right? That would be a good thing. That would be a win if that happened. I think that where we do, beyond maybe my being slightly less optimistic about that, right? Mm-hmm. Whether they would definitely do that or not, because I think, I generally assume that courts are going to rule in pro establishment ways and come up with justifications for it. And I think in this case, I can kind of see what the shape of the justification would be. I hope you're right. I hope they would. But I would also argue, I think the substantive disagreement that we have is about whether government promotion of corporate censorship is sort of the main event, right? Or whether the corporate censorship itself is the main event. And the point I was making about the legal question is that, to the extent that they have a legal argument here, and, again, maybe you think that maybe there's a sufficient body of precedent here that the Supreme Court, which is usually extraordinarily deferential to the national security state, would actually rule the way that you hope they would here, right?
I have no confidence that they will in this case, but go ahead.
But if they don't, right, presumably the argument that they will use not to, right, is going to be precisely about the idea that the final call here was made by private owners, which I think points us to the fact that there is that there is a deeper free speech issue here, right? That there's the sort of that beyond the question of the government promotion of it, at the, if you want to call that the tippy top, right? From almost the top, right? From the corporate oligarchs themselves, censorship from that quarter is itself it's itself an extremely serious problem. And I would argue that's the bigger problem. If I find corporate censorship itself horrifying, I'm obviously not interested in justifying government promotion of corporate censorship, right? That would be a strange, incoherent combination of positions. But my argument is that the government promotion, while bad, isn't the heart of the problem. That's my argument.
Okay, so here's this lays behind my heated response before. This is the reason I react against what you're saying now, but it's I can understand where you're coming from. I think you're offering that argument in good faith. But here's the thing: in our current society, any company that tries to create a press is likely to also form a corporation. So when you're talking about corporate media, that's a very broad range of media companies that can range from some small communist press. I think Verso is probably a corporation, and to, Fox News or something.
Sure.
The problem when it comes to corporate media dominance is the combination of monopoly power, the capital concentration in a few hands, and an ideology that is pro capitalist or corporate. And that's what manufacturing consent is about. It's about how the concentration of money into a few media companies, when combined with a mechanism of sorting for the political class through the elite institutions and and so on and so forth, creates conditions that are almost as if you have a totalitarian state directing people on what to publish and what isn't, what not to. And that's what manufacturing consent's argument is. What we're facing right now is not only this, everything I've been arguing about before, but also a moment where through the Restrict Act, which is a bipartisan bill, we're about to empower the executive to simply decide on the basis of national security which companies can have business licenses and which ones can't. I mean, there's a little more to it than that. If they've taken any foreign money or can be shown to have any foreign influence, they can be shut down by the executive. That's the Restrict Act. That's not a Democratic Party bill. That's not a Republican bill. It's bipartisan. It is in line with everything that's been developing since the war on terror and before, but certainly since George W. Bush, and more recently since 2017, when the Department of Homeland Security declared all of our communications infrastructure as under its jurisdiction, therefore making all information in the country a matter for the Department of Homeland Security to sort out. Yeah. And meanwhile, we've got intelligence communities in Sweden calling themselves the Department of Psychological Security. So there's this Orwellian aspect to this that seems to be being literally realized in front of our eyes, and people on the left and on the majority report, and particularly because of not liking Matt Taibbi for some reason, and because certainly not because they don't like Elon Musk, are willing to turn a blind eye to it.
I mean, I haven't really watched the majority report in years, so you're definitely better positioned to tell me about that than I am. But I have, I would just say, right, that I think you're right about the Restrict Act, and I think you're right about manufacturing consent, but where I would see left out of that picture, right, is that, the manufacturing consent stuff is about the way that propagandistic narratives are manufactured by, media publishers. And I think you've accurately described the source of the problem as far as that goes. But I think that's a problem, but I think it's a different problem than corporate censorship when it comes to platforms, right? That the whole justification for that immunity from lawsuits that you think they need to stay in business, my maybe just more pessimistic projection is that they would just censor much harder and stay in business, but who knows? They have but the whole justification for that immunity from lawsuits is precisely that they shouldn't be treated as a publisher who's liable for whatever they publish, because they're not a publisher, they're a platform. And I think at that point, I think that having corporate owned platforms censor is a different issue than having corporate publishers promote propagandistic narratives. That they have that's like again, that one strikes me as more like a privatized post office refusing to publish, refusing to send certain magazines through the mail because they dislike the political content of the magazines, or they think they're Putin apologists or whatever, right? Like that middle problem seems like a sort of independent problem in its own right that is different from and goes beyond what the manufacturing consent stuff is about, even when all of the other stuff you're talking about isn't also in play.
So Ben, here's why I react to that. Right now, there are 2 Supreme Court cases, and one of them is about whether or not these tech companies should be treated like neutral, like the post office, like the telephone companies, or whether or not they should have any editorial control and ability to to be basically whether they themselves have First Amendment rights. Okay. And then there's the other one, which is, has the Biden administration, Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, violated the First Amendment rights of a slew of people who were censored online, including somebody who turned out to be right about COVID and lockdowns, and had an epidemiologist, Bhattacharya, I think is his name. And so those are 2 cases. And when the weaker of the 2 is the first one. The necessity to take away the First Amendment rights of these big companies is going to be harder to argue, to make them be neutral. It's going to be harder to argue for, and is constitutionally shakier than the second case, where we can demonstrate that they create institutions for censorship. In other words, for the control of the press, which is against the violation of the First Amendment. They censored millions of people. They applied pressure on the tech companies, and and these people's First Amendment rights were violated in the process. But what happened recently on 60 Minutes was that they conflated the 2.
Okay.
And failed to really clarify what was at stake. And I know this because now this is where I'm kind of following the reporting of Matt Taibbi and others. So, I trust but verify on this. But the point is that the conflation of these 2 issues serves the function of weakening the second case.
But notice that I'm doing the opposite of conflating them. I'm saying that you're not drawing enough distinctions.
Right. But okay. The way I think what I've heard is that I basically, what I heard in the conversation was that you were saying that, of course, the government has the right to tell.
No, I never said, of course, the government has that right. I never came close to saying that.
Right. Okay. Well, they don't what you said was, I think that there's not any legal precedent to show that it's a First Amendment violation when they merely advise.
Yeah,
that has been shown. But when you add in the fact that
I didn't even quite say that, but I have but I said that I could see that there being a lot more legal wiggle room there, right? Which, again, I mean, depending on what we're talking about, I think we agreed that that there was like a decent chance that the Supreme Court would ultimately say that, right? They have I'm not sure, again, I think that I think the fact that it would be legally defensible, that there's a legal defense that you could run that isn't completely out of left field, that you could imagine the Supreme Court, siding with, right? That, that ultimately is about, well, the ultimate call was made by the private owners. Whereas, right, if like the actual USPS decided that they were going to stop, they were going to do their equivalent of like YouTube's thing where they have they automatically, they demonetize anything or like ban it that they say is denying or making light of, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? That distinction, right? That like if the USPS did that, that would be unambiguously unconstitutional, right? I think that tells me that there's a deeper problem of corporate censorship that goes beyond whatever's true one way or the other about the issue we've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, listen, I just realized that John Bunch and Ashley Frawley had been waiting in the green room, but I think it was healthy that you yelled at me, and I don't know if it was healthy that I yelled and got mad and muted you, but I think this is a good beginning for a conversation about this, and maybe I
Fair
can
enough.
cooler
Hey.
heads will prevail. But I do want to say one last thing to you, Ben, before we wrap this up, which is that. Okay, I'm just going to lay it out there. I feel as though that there's a certain milieu which is trying reflexively wants to and wants to turn this. Okay, let me say it a different way. I think there's an ideology amongst the left, which I often have shared, that says the state can step in and can run things better than the private sector. And that's like a normal thought on the left, right? Through this process, I have become far less enamored with the prospect of the state putting any limits on private presses or private communications. And I would, and I also think that the First Amendment would disallow for these tech companies to be forced into that position. That certainly the Supreme Court was not very unlikely to do that, and that the more solid ground that we have to stand on is the most base level interpretation of, hey, the state cannot pass new laws or create institutions to censor the free press, and the free press is defined along private property lines. It's not, and so anyway, that's my final.
Yeah, I mean, my point would just be, look, if you literally had public ownership, then the First Amendment issue would be extremely clear, right? It would be like the USPS decided which magazines they were going to send through the mail on political grounds. And again, I hope as far as the state stepping in to encourage corporate censorship, I hope that the Supreme Court rules the way that you said. I think that would be good if they ruled that way. I would just point out that if they did rule that way, you would still have a major issue of corporate censorship of platforms that would remain to be dealt with.
Right. That's true. I don't disagree with you.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.